before the samurai, before the shoguns, before Japan closed its borders to the world. There was a person who was neither man nor woman living openly in the imperial court, worshipped in some shrines as sacred, and it erased almost entirely from the history books we were handed in school. This is the story of what it meant to live outside the binary in ancient Japan, and why an entire third gender identity, once tolerated, sometimes revered, was slowly written out of existence. Picture a Shinto shrine at dawn, incense curling upward, and a figure standing before the altar, dressed in robes that belonged to neither category society had built. Not fully man, not fully woman, and yet, in this world, not fully outcast either. For centuries, that contradiction was simply life. Not a debate, not a headline, just a Tuesday. To understand this person, we have to understand the world they were born into. Long before Japan adopted rigid Confucian gender roles from mainland China, its indigenous spiritual traditions had room, real, structural room, for people who didn't fit neatly into male or female. Shinto, Japan's native belief system, was built on the idea that kami, the spirits inhabiting the natural world, were not confined by human categories. Some kami were male, some were female, some were both, or neither, or shifted depending on which region told the myth and which century recorded it. If the gods themselves weren't bound by gender, why would every human have to be? This is where our story begins, with a role that existed at the intersection of the sacred and the human, the Miko, and lesser known, a rarer figure often described in historical and folkloric records as occupying the space of the spirit world's own onagata, a person assigned male at birth who lived, dressed, and served in feminine or gender-blended roles, sometimes as a shrine attendant, sometimes as a performer, sometimes simply as themselves in their village. Historians and anthropologists studying pre-modern Japan have identified evidence of these third gender roles across multiple eras, and while individual names rarely survive, the historical record was not kind to those it didn't consider worth remembering. The pattern is unmistakable. People existed outside the binary, and in certain corners of ancient Japanese society, they were not hidden. They were needed. Let's call our central figure Kaya, a name meaning reed grass, flexible, bending in the wind without breaking. Kaya is not one single person plucked from a history book. Kaya is a composite, built from the fragments historians have pieced together from temple records, court diaries, and folklore passed down through generations. A representative life, assembled so we can walk through what existence might have actually felt like for someone like this, rather than staring at a list of disconnected facts scattered across 1,000 years. Kaya was born in a farming village, sometime in what scholars generally place in the Heian-period, roughly the 9th to 12th century, an era remembered today for its poetry, its court intrigue, and its obsession with beauty and refinement. It was a world where a man might weep openly over a well-composed 31-syllable poem, where the correct shade of purple silk could make or break a courtier's reputation, and where the line between masculine and feminine aesthetics was already, in elite circles, far blurrier than most people assume. Kaya's parents noticed early that their child did not want the roles assigned to boys. Kaya wanted to weave. Kaya wanted to sing in the register reserved for women. Kaya wanted to grow their hair long, in the elaborate style only girls and women wore, the kind that could take an hour to arrange and another hour to unwind. And here's the detail that surprises most people today. The family didn't panic. They didn't try to correct it. In a rural Shinto household, a child who seemed to carry the nature of both a boy and a girl wasn't automatically seen as broken. Some communities saw it as a sign the child belonged to the spirits. that they might be marked for shrine service, where blended or crossed gender expression was, in certain regions, considered spiritually powerful rather than shameful. A local priest, according to the kind of oral tradition scholars still catalogue in remote shrine archives, is said to have visited Kaya's household and declared the child touched by the kami of boundaries, a spirit said to dwell at crossroads, river mouths, and other places where one thing becomes another. Ask yourself, how many people today assume tolerance is a purely modern invention, that every century before ours was uniformly cruel to anyone who didn't fit the mold? History is messier than that, and messier is more interesting. By the time Kaya reached adolescence, they were sent to train at a shrine some distance from home, partly for religious education, partly, historians suspect, because families in this era sometimes used shrine service as a path for a child who didn't fit conventional marriage expectations. The journey there, on foot along a mountain road, is said to have taken 3 days. Kaya travelled dressed as neither a son leaving home nor a daughter being sent to marry, but in a simple travelling robe that marked them as something else entirely, a shrine initiate, a category flexible enough to hold whatever Kaya turned out to be. At the shrine, Kaya encountered others like them. Not many, but enough to know they weren't the only one. Among Shinto shrine attendants and certain travelling performer troupes, there existed loosely organized communities of people living in what modern scholars would now describe as a third gender, dressing, speaking, and moving through the world in ways that blended or transcended the two categories Japanese society officially recognized. There was an older attendant, decades into shrine service, who taught Kaya the correct hand movements for a purification ritual, and who, in the fragments historians have reconstructed, seems to have functioned as something like a mentor, an elder who had survived long enough in this liminal space to make survival look almost effortless. But tolerance in one sphere of life did not mean freedom everywhere. This is where the story turns. Outside the shrine walls, the wider social order was shifting. Confucian ideas imported from China were steadily tightening the definitions of what a man was supposed to be and what a woman was supposed to be. Land inheritance depended on it. Marriage contracts depended on it. Military obligation depended on it. A person like Kaya, existing in the space between, was increasingly a problem for a bureaucracy that wanted clean categories, not human complexity. The imperial court itself, for all its poetry and aesthetic refinement, was simultaneously importing an administrative philosophy that had no interest in nuance. 2 columns, male, female. Choose one and choose it permanently, in ink. Here's the twist most documentaries skip entirely. The danger wasn't always persecution in the form of violence. Often it was something quieter, and in some ways crueler, erasure through paperwork. Household registries, tax records, marriage documentation, all of it demanded a binary answer. People like Kaya either had to perform a gender they didn't feel, permanently, on paper, or risk being administratively invisible, unable to inherit, unable to marry, unable to be legally protected if they were harmed. A person could be beloved in their village, celebrated at their local shrine, and still functionally erased the moment a tax collector arrived from the provincial capital with a ledger and a fixed idea of what belonged in each column. Imagine spending your entire life navigating 2 truths at once. In the shrine, among your community, you are seen. In the world of taxes, land, and law, you don't officially exist. Kaya's life, as historians reconstruct lives like this, likely involved exactly that kind of double existence. Within the shrine and among performer communities, some of whom would later evolve into the traditions we associate with kabuki theatre, where male actors called onagata specialized in playing women with such precision that audiences debated whether gender was something you were born with or something you performed. Kaya could exist authentically, but travel outside those protected spaces, into a market town, into a province governed by a strict provincial lord enforcing the new Confucian household codes, and Kaya became something else. A target for suspicion. Sometimes there's a specific kind of injustice worth sitting with here. It wasn't always the sword. It was the slow, grinding violence of a system that simply refused to make room for you, that forced you to choose between authenticity and survival over and over for an entire lifetime. Every trip to the market, every encounter with an unfamiliar official, every year the registry had to be renewed. 1,000 small negotiations, repeated for decades, each one carrying the quiet risk of everything unraveling. And yet, resilience. This is the part that gets lost when we only tell tragic stories. Kaya's community found ways to protect their own. Shrine networks passed word to each other about which provinces were safer, which local magistrates could be bribed or reasoned with, which festivals offered temporary sanctioned space for gender-nonconforming performers to appear publicly, celebrated rather than hidden. Consider one such festival, the kind historians believe existed in various forms across rural Japan during this period, a seasonal rite tied to the boundary between summer and autumn, when it was believed the world of spirits and the world of the living pressed especially close together. For 3 nights, the normal rules loosened. Performers who blurred gender lines didn't just appear at the margins of the crowd. They led the procession. Villagers who might have whispered about Kaya on an ordinary Tuesday lined the road to watch them dance, dressed in a costume that combined a warrior's armor, plating with a bride's trailing sleeves, embodying the very boundary the festival itself was built to honor. For those 3 nights, the thing that made Kaya vulnerable made Kaya sacred. Children were lifted onto shoulders to see them pass. Elderly villagers murmured blessings. And then, on the 4th morning, the ordinary rules quietly returned, and Kaya went back to being careful. That contrast is worth sitting with. The same body, the same voice, the same person, celebrated in torchlight and precarious in daylight, sometimes within the space of a single week. Then comes the turning point every version of this story eventually reaches, the moment the fragile balance breaks. In Kaya's case, historians point to a recurring pattern documented across many similar figures. A provincial lord, newly appointed, eager to prove his loyalty to the increasingly rigid Confucian-influenced imperial court, orders a crackdown on shrine practices he considers improper. It is not framed in the surviving records as an act of cruelty. It is framed as reform, an effort to bring the countryside's messy, ancient customs in line with the capital's new sense of order. That framing, historians note, is exactly how so much persecution throughout history gets justified, not as hatred, but as tidiness. Shrine attendants living outside conventional gender roles are singled out first, because they are the most visible symbol of everything the new order wants to correct. Some are forced out of their positions. Some are forcibly reassigned to roles matching the sex they were assigned at birth, made to cut their hair, made to wear the clothing of the gender their birth certificate insisted on. Some simply disappear from the records, a chilling phrase historians use often, because disappearing from the records could mean exile, could mean death, or could mean the person fled somewhere. The paperwork simply couldn't follow them, deep into a mountain village or a port town where a new magistrate hadn't yet arrived to ask questions. We don't know exactly what happened to the person Kaya represents. That itself is the point. The record doesn't end with a clean resolution because history rarely gives us one. What survives instead are fragments, a shrine ledger noting an attendant's sudden absence, a folk song referencing a shrine performer who vanished after a magistrate's visit, a temple account describing a ritual banned the following year for reasons left unrecorded, and a single, strange line in a regional gazetteer describing an unnamed traveller who arrived in a distant fishing village claiming no family and no home province, and who was, in the gazetteer's careful phrasing, received without further questions asked. Historians studying these documents can't confirm it's the same person, but they also can't rule it out. And there's something quietly moving about a phrase like received without further questions asked surviving 8 or 9 centuries, a small act of unremarked kindness outlasting the empire that tried to erase the need for it. But here's what we can say with confidence, because the broader historical pattern is well documented. As Japan moved deeper into the medieval period and eventually into the strict social hierarchies of the Edo era, the space for third-gender existence didn't disappear completely, but it narrowed dramatically, and it became conditional. The wakashu, a recognized category of adolescent males who occupied a distinct gender position between boyhood and adult manhood, continued to exist for centuries, romantically and socially acknowledged in ways later generations would find startling. Kabuki's Onagata tradition preserved a public, celebrated space for gender performance well into the modern era, and some of its most famous practitioners lived their entire lives, on and off stage, in a blended gender presentation that audiences accepted as simply part of who they were. But the sacred, spiritually protected version of third-gender identity that existed in Kaya's world, tied directly to Shinto belief rather than performance alone, was gradually pushed to the margins. Folklore rather than accepted social reality, something whispered about in remote villages rather than practiced openly in the capital. So what does this actually tell us? It tells us that the binary so many societies present as ancient, unchangeable, and universal was, in Japan's own history, a relatively late imposition. Before bureaucratic Confucian order tightened its grip, there was a native spiritual framework flexible enough to hold people like Kaya without demanding they choose a side. The persecution that eventually followed wasn't some eternal human instinct, hardwired since the dawn of civilization. It was a policy decision made by specific people for specific political reasons at a specific point in time, and enforced by specific officials who could just as easily have looked the other way. That distinction matters, because if intolerance was built, historically, deliberately, then it reveals something almost hopeful buried inside a hard story. What was constructed can also be dismantled. The rigid categories that pushed people like Kaya into the shadows weren't handed down from the beginning of time. They were choices, and every choice made by one generation can be unmade, questioned, or rebuilt by the next. There is something quietly radical about realizing that 1,000 years ago, in shrines scattered across the Japanese countryside, someone stood before an altar dressed as neither fully man nor fully woman, and was told by their own tradition, "You belong here, not despite what you are, because of it, not tolerated as an exception to the rule, but written into the rule itself, present in the myths, honored in the festivals, needed at the boundary between one season and the next." We will likely never know Kaya's real name, if such a specific person even existed in the singular way we've told it here. But the pattern behind them is real, documented, and stubbornly persistent across centuries of Japanese religious and social history. third gender identity in ancient Japan wasn't a modern import layered onto an unwilling past. It was there from the beginning, woven into the belief system itself before later generations decided it needed to be edited out, category by category, ledger by ledger. History, it turns out, isn't only written by the victors. Sometimes it's unwritten by them too, quietly, bureaucratically, one land registry and one banned ritual at a time, until an entire way of living simply stops appearing in the documents, and future generations are left assuming it never existed at all. And maybe that's the real lesson buried in Kaya's fragmented story. Not that the past was simply cruel, and not that it was simply accepting, but that both existed at once, in tension, the way they still do today. The struggle over who gets to exist without apology didn't begin in the 20th century. It was already old news 1,000 years ago, whispered in shrine courtyards, danced in torchlight for 3 nights a year, and then carefully hidden again come morning, long before any of us were born. If a society once had room for someone like Kaya, and later chose to close that room, the door was never truly sealed. It was only